There are some stories a mother never dreams she will have to tell. Some truths are so heavy, so suffocating, that carrying them feels like living under a storm that never clears. I had always believed that the greatest danger came from the outside world. Strangers lurking in the shadows, distant forces that could shatter a family. I never thought the threat would grow inside my own home, beneath my own roof, in the heart of the boy I had once cradled in my arms. When I think back, it didn't begin as a storm. It began as small clouds, whispers of darkness that seemed harmless at first. My son was born into a world of love and promise. From the moment he opened his eyes, I believed he would be my reason to endure every hardship. I was young, struggling, and uncertain of the future, but his existence gave me strength. I poured everything I had into raising him, my time, my energy, my soul. He became my anchor in a world that often felt cruel. For years, I told myself he was just strong-willed, that his stubborn streak was nothing unusual. Many children test their boundaries. Many push back against the rules. But over time, his defiance hardened into something sharper, something colder. As he grew older, I noticed the way he looked at people, as if every kindness was a weakness to be exploited. His smile, once innocent, began to feel like a mask he wore whenever it suited him. There were warning signs, of course, moments I now replay endlessly in my mind. A missing wallet that suddenly reappeared when I threatened to call the police. A broken piece of jewelry that he insisted must have been misplaced. A series of lies told so smoothly that even I, his own mother, wanted to believe them. Every time I convinced myself it was just a phase, a stumble along the path to adulthood. I never wanted to accept the truth, that something darker was taking root inside him. Life in our home became an unpredictable rhythm of calm and chaos. There were days when he would charm everyone around him, winning their admiration with ease. Teachers spoke of his potential, neighbors praised his charisma, and relatives envied the bond they thought we shared. But behind closed doors I saw the cracks. The way his temper flared over the smallest disappointments. The way he could turn silent, his eyes narrowing with a rage he never fully expressed but always carried. I thought love could cure it. I believed that if I just held on, if I just kept giving, he would soften. Mothers are trained to believe in the redemptive power of unconditional love. And I loved him more fiercely than I had ever loved anyone. I told myself that even if the world turned against him, I never would. That I could stand as his shield against everything, even his own demons. But what do you do when the person you need to shield him from is himself? What do you do when you realize that your son, the child you sacrifice for, the one you dreamed for, sees you not as a mother but as an obstacle in his path? The shift was gradual, like a shadow creeping across the floor at sunset. First it was little things. He would borrow money and never pay it back. He would manipulate relatives into giving him gifts he didn't need. He would lie about where he was, and when I pressed him, he would twist the blame onto me, making me question my own memory, my own sanity. I didn't realize it then, but he was learning how to bend people to his will, how to make deception his greatest weapon. Then came the threats, subtle at first. A coldness in his voice, a sharpness in his tone. Not direct, not violent, but enough to make me pause. Enough to make me wonder if the boy I raised would ever cross that line. And yet, even then, I told myself he wouldn't. He was my son. He was the baby I had once rocked to sleep, the child whose laughter had once filled my world with light. I wanted so badly to believe the good in him. But denial is a fragile shield, and reality has a way of shattering it. The night that changed everything began like any other. The house was quiet, the air heavy with the silence that had become so common between us. I was in the kitchen clearing dishes when I felt his eyes on me. It wasn't the gaze of a son looking at his mother. It was something else, something predatory, calculating. For the first time in my life, I felt fear in my own home. Fear of the very child I had brought into this world. That night marked the beginning of the end, though I couldn't admit it then. It was the first time I understood that love, no matter how deep, could not erase the truth staring me in the face. He was no longer the boy I thought I knew. He was becoming a man I couldn't recognize. A man who saw my love not as salvation but as something to exploit, something to destroy if it stood in his way. The realization settled in my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. I wanted to cry, to scream, to beg the universe to turn back time and give me my son back. But instead I stood frozen, my hands trembling as I pretended to continue with my chores. I knew that if I showed weakness, he would seize it. I knew that if I confronted him too soon, the fragile thread holding us together would snap. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the creaks of the house, wondering if he was awake too, wondering what thoughts were circling in his mind. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that no son would ever harm his mother. But deep down I knew the truth. The storm had already arrived, and I was standing directly in its path. By the time morning came, nothing looked the same. The walls of my home, once a place of safety, now felt like a trap. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like a warning. I realized then that I wasn't just living with my son. I was living with a stranger who carried my son's face. And though I couldn't yet admit it, this stranger was capable of things I had once believed impossible. Still, I clung to hope, desperate and blind. Because that's what mothers do. We hope even when hope is dangerous. We love, even when love is weaponized against us. And we tell ourselves that no matter how dark it gets, the light of the child we once held close still flickers somewhere inside. I didn't know then just how far he would go. I didn't know that the boy I loved with every part of my being would soon stand at the edge of a choice that would nearly take my life. All I knew was that something irreversible had begun, and there was no turning back. And as the days unfolded, I would come to learn that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies outside our door. Sometimes it comes from the person we loved most, the one we never believed would turn against us. The story was only beginning, and the darkest chapters were still ahead. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that what I felt that night was only paranoia, a mother's overactive imagination twisting shadows into monsters. I told myself that exhaustion had clouded my judgment, that my son's eyes hadn't truly carried that unsettling coldness. But denial can only shield you for so long before reality finds a way to pierce through. Small things began to change around the house, and with each one the uneasy truth grew harder to ignore. It wasn't just his silence anymore. It was his presence, heavy and watchful, as though he was constantly calculating something I could not see. He started locking his bedroom door, hoarding objects he once left scattered openly. I would notice knives missing from the kitchen drawer, only to reappear days later in strange places, as though deliberately placed to remind me of their absence. I began to live in a constant state of vigilance. Each morning I examined the house as though it were a crime scene, searching for subtle signs of danger. A misplaced tool, a broken window latch, a bottle of pills suddenly half empty. None of it could be proven as intentional, but together it built a picture I could no longer ignore. The boy who once ran to me for comfort had become someone I no longer trusted to walk behind me without fear. The manipulation deepened, too. He had mastered the art of turning others against me, of spinning tales that painted me as controlling, paranoid, even cruel. Relatives who once stood by me began to withdraw, swayed by his charm and his carefully crafted words. When I tried to share my concerns, they dismissed them as the exaggerations of a weary mother. They saw only his smile, his charisma, his ability to play the role of a misunderstood young man. I was the only one who saw the shadows lurking beneath. At times I questioned my own sanity. Could I really believe my son was capable of hurting me? Was I so blinded by fear that I was creating danger where none existed? But those doubts always fell away in the moments when I caught his eyes lingering too long, unblinking and detached, as if he was studying me not as a mother but as an obstacle. It was a gaze that stripped me of any illusion that love could shield me from harm. The financial strain added another layer to the storm. He demanded more money, always with a story that tugged at my heart. A lost job, a failed opportunity, an urgent need that only I could fulfill. Each time I gave in, hoping it would be the last, hoping he would see my sacrifice and soften. But with every dollar handed over, his hunger only grew. It wasn't about need anymore. It was about power, about watching how far he could push before I broke. One evening, after draining my savings once again, he stood taller, more confident, as though he had discovered his strength in my weakness. I realized then that I had not been helping him. I had been feeding something dangerous, something that thrived on my surrender. I had mistaken control for care, and now he was using it against me. The house became suffocating, filled with tension that never lifted. I no longer felt safe in my own bedroom. I found myself locking the door at night, clutching a phone in my hand, listening for the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. Sleep became rare, and when it came it was shallow, haunted by dreams of betrayal and danger. I would wake drenched in fear, only to find him standing in the kitchen silent, watching me as though he knew exactly what thoughts had chased me through the night. The more isolated I became, the stronger he seemed to grow. Friends drifted away, relatives dismissed me, and neighbors barely glanced in my direction. It was as though I had been silenced, erased by his careful web of lies. He knew I had nowhere to turn, and he thrived on that knowledge. It was a power shift I felt in every word, every glance, every moment we shared under the same roof. There were days when I still tried to see the child he once was. I would look at old photographs, at the smile that had once been pure, at the eyes that once shone with innocence. For fleeting moments, I allowed myself to believe that boy still existed somewhere within him. But those moments were fragile and quickly shattered by reality. The man standing before me now was not the boy in those pictures. He was someone else entirely, someone I barely recognized yet couldn't escape. The first direct sign of danger came one night when I entered the kitchen and found the stove left on, the flame burning low, the air heavy with gas. First I thought it was an accident. But then I saw his shadow in the hallway, lingering, waiting, watching me as though to measure my reaction. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared as I rushed to turn the knob and open the windows. In that moment I understood. It wasn't carelessness. It was a test. A silent warning that he had the power to decide whether I lived or died. That night marked a turning point. I could no longer tell myself this was just a troubled young man finding his way. This was something darker, something deliberate. I was living in a house with a person who was slowly learning how to control me through fear, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he acted on the thoughts that flickered in his eyes. Yet even as fear consumed me, love refused to let go. I still remembered the baby I had once held close, the child who had once reached for me in the night, the little boy who once whispered dreams of what he wanted to become. That memory kept me chained, even when the danger was clear, told me to hold on, to wait, to hope. But deep down, I knew the storm was only beginning. The stove was just the first strike, the opening act in a play that would grow darker with each passing day. I could sense it in the way he moved, in the way he studied me, in the way he tested the boundaries between life and death. And as I lay awake that night, listening once more for the sound of his footsteps, I realized that the greatest betrayal wasn't simply his willingness to harm me. It was the cruel reality that I would still love him, even if he succeeded. Because love, when bound by blood, is not always a shield. Sometimes it is the very chain that holds us in place as the danger closes in. The silence of that night pressed against me like a weight, and I knew there would be no peace in the days to come. The path had been set, and each step forward would bring me closer to the moment I feared most. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a battlefield, and I was waiting for the first strike to fall. The days after the stove incident blurred into one long stretch of unease. I moved through the house as if walking on glass, each step cautious, each breath careful. There was no safety in routine anymore, no comfort in the familiar spaces I had once called my sanctuary. Every corner carried a shadow, every sound carried a warning. I had once believed that home was the one place where I could rest, but now it was the very place where I braced myself for survival. My son seemed to sense this fear, and it pleased him. I could see it in the way his shoulders straightened when I avoided his gaze, in the smirk that curled at his lips when I double-checked the locks, in the silence that grew heavier between us. He had discovered something powerful, the ability to control me without raising his hand. And control was an intoxicating drug for him. It gave him a purpose, a weapon, a way to bend me into the shape he desired. He began to test these boundaries more openly. Objects disappeared from their places and reappeared in strange spots, as though to remind me that nothing in the house truly belonged to me anymore. My phone was found with calls I hadn't made. My mail was opened before I touched it, and even private notes I scribbled down were suddenly missing. It was as if he wanted me to know he could reach into every part of my life, stripping away even the smallest illusion of privacy. I learned to hide my fear, but inside I was unraveling. My mind was in constant motion, calculating every possibility, every outcome, every way I could be harmed. Nights became the hardest. Sleep refused to come, and when it did, it was broken by the sound of creaking floors and the faint click of doors. I would lie frozen, staring at the ceiling, listening as his footsteps circled the house like a predator pacing outside its prey's cage. I began to wonder if he was waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect plan to strike. The isolation deepened. I tried to reach out to those I once trusted, but their responses cut me deeper than silence. They dismissed my fears as exaggeration, as paranoia, as a tired woman imagining demons in the face of her own child. I could see the doubt in their eyes, the judgment in their voices. They saw only his charm, his smile, his ability to play the role of the misunderstood son. To them he was troubled perhaps, but never dangerous. The more I tried to explain, the more I sounded like a woman losing her grip on reality. And that was exactly what he wanted. By painting me as unstable, he isolated me further, leaving me alone in my terror. It was a tactic that worked flawlessly, because who would ever believe a mother when she said her son wanted to harm her? The very idea sounded impossible. And yet, I was living inside that impossibility every single day. There were moments when I still tried to reason with myself, to believe I was wrong. I clung to memories of his childhood, moments that felt like pieces of a dream I could no longer touch. The sound of his laughter when he played in the yard, the way he clung to my hand on the first day of school, the way he once whispered that he would protect me when I grew old. Those memories haunted me now, because they no longer belonged to the boy standing before me. They were relics of someone who no longer existed. Then came the night I found the knife. It was under my pillow, waiting for me as though placed there deliberately. The handle cold against my fingers, the blade glinting faintly in the dark. I froze, my breath caught in my chest, knowing immediately that this was not an accident. He had been in my room, had stood over my bed, had slid that blade beneath my pillow as I slept. It was not meant for me to use. It was meant for me to find, to remind me that I was never beyond his reach. I held that knife in my hands and realized how thin the line had become between threat and action. My son was not just testing boundaries anymore. He was preparing me for something inevitable. The thought of it sent a shiver through me, but at the same time, a strange numbness crept in. Fear had been my constant companion for so long that it had begun to harden into something else, something closer to resignation. Still, I couldn't bring myself to leave. The chains of love bound me tighter than any lock could. I told myself that walking away would mean abandoning him to the darkness growing inside him, that if I just endured a little longer, perhaps something would change. It was foolish hope, but it was all I had left. For mothers, love is not something easily severed, even when it becomes the very rope that strangles. In the days that followed, his behavior became more erratic. He alternated between moments of charm and flashes of cruelty, keeping me off balance, uncertain of which version of him I would face. Sometimes he was affectionate, speaking softly, almost kindly, as though to remind me of the boy I once knew. Other times his silence was so heavy it felt like a threat in itself. Each mood shift was deliberate, calculated to keep me guessing, to keep me trapped in a cycle of hope and fear. The house itself became an accomplice to his game. Locks clicked open when I swore I had secured them, lights flickered on in rooms I hadn't entered, and doors stood ajar though I remembered closing them. I began to question my own memory, wondering if exhaustion was blurring the edges of reality. But then I would see his eyes watching me from the shadows, and I knew it was not my mind that was failing. It was his mercy that was running out. The breaking point came one morning when I awoke to find words scrawled across my bathroom mirror in condensation. "It won't be long." My knees buckled and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I knew he had stood there as I slept, close enough to hear my breathing, close enough to end it if he chose. But he hadn't. Not yet. Instead, he left me a message, a cruel promise of what was to come. That day, the world outside felt like a foreign place. The sun was too bright, the air too free, the people too careless in their laughter. They had no idea what it was to live under a roof where every breath might be your last, where every glance might be the prelude to betrayal. I envied them, but I also resented them. They could never understand the prison I lived in. A prison built not of walls but of blood ties and a mother's unyielding love. And as night fell once more, I lay awake knowing that the next chapter of this torment was drawing closer. The signs were no longer whispers. They were declarations, warnings etched into every corner of my life. My son was preparing for something final, and I could no longer deny it. Yet even then, even as terror closed in, my heart betrayed me. Because I still loved him. I loved the child he once was, the boy I once believed he could be, the dream I once carried in my arms. That love, unshakable and cruel, bound me to him even as the threat of death loomed closer. And so I waited, caught between love and fear, knowing the storm had not yet reached its full fury. The knife under my pillow, the words on the mirror, the eyes that watched me in the night, they were all preludes. The true betrayal, the final act, was still to come. The message on the mirror became the line I could not erase from my thoughts. No matter how I tried to push it away, it lingered like a shadow etched into my mind, a reminder that I was living in a countdown whose end I could not see. Every breath became a calculation, every step a silent negotiation with fate. I no longer wondered if he would act, only when. The atmosphere in the house thickened with tension, pressing down on me until even the simplest tasks felt unbearable. Cooking a meal, folding laundry, walking down the hallway. Each action carried with it the fear of what might happen next. I found myself moving more quietly, speaking less often, as though by shrinking myself I could delay what was coming. But shrinking did nothing. If anything, it seemed to fuel him further. My fear was no longer hidden, and he fed on it like oxygen. His control deepened in ways that were almost invisible to others. The bank account that I once managed alone began to show withdrawals I had not made. My credit card carried charges for items I never purchased, tools and supplies that I could not trace. When I confronted him, he denied everything with such practiced ease that even I questioned my own memory. Gaslighting became his weapon, twisting reality until I doubted myself more than I doubted him. That was how he tightened the noose, convincing me that I was the one unraveling while he stood calm and collected. But beneath his calm exterior, there was something brewing. I saw it in the way his movements grew sharper, his silences heavier. He began disappearing for hours, sometimes days, returning with an energy that felt dangerous, charged with secrets he refused to share. His eyes, once capable of charm, now carried a hardness that made my skin crawl. He was preparing for something, gathering pieces of a plan I was not allowed to see. The first attempt came quietly, hidden within the routine of daily life. I woke one morning with an unusual heaviness in my body, my vision clouded, my thoughts sluggish. It was not the ordinary fatigue of sleepless nights. It was deeper, as though my very blood had thickened. When I staggered into the kitchen, I noticed my cup of tea on the counter, already poured, steam curling faintly from its surface. I had not made it. The realization struck cold through my veins. I set it aside untouched, but the weakness in my body lingered for hours. That was when I understood that his intentions were no longer confined to threats or warnings. He had crossed into action, testing how close he could bring me to the edge without pushing me over it. The knowledge chilled me, but it also confirmed what my instincts had been screaming all along. My son had begun the process of trying to kill me. Still, I did not run. The chains of love are not easily broken, even when they bind you to danger. Part of me believed that if I stayed, if I showed him that my love had not wavered, I could pull him back from the brink. Another part of me feared that leaving would provoke him into finishing what he had started. I was trapped in a paradox where every choice felt like a step toward destruction. The second attempt was less subtle. I came home one evening to find the house unnaturally silent. As I entered the kitchen, I noticed the faint smell of gas again. This time it was stronger, more deliberate. The stove knobs had been turned just enough to release fumes, not enough to ignite a flame. My hands trembled as I twisted them shut, my heart pounding with the certainty that this was no mistake. The house had been prepared for me to walk into my own death. I opened every window, my mind spinning with fear and disbelief. I wanted to scream, to confront him, to demand why he was doing this. But I knew better. To confront him directly would only hand him the satisfaction of my terror. Instead, I moved through the motions in silence, all the while aware that I was living inside a trap set by the person I loved most. From that moment on, I began to watch him as closely as he watched me. Every movement, every glance, every word became evidence. I studied him the way one studies an enemy, alert to the smallest changes. Yet even in that vigilance, I could not stop my heart from aching at the sight of him. For in between the cruelty and the menace, there were still flickers of the boy I had raised. A laugh that echoed with the memory of childhood, a gesture that mirrored the tenderness he once carried. It was those fleeting glimpses that kept me bound, that convinced me there was still something left to save. But with each passing day, those glimpses grew rarer, swallowed by the darkness that consumed him. He no longer hid his disdain, no longer softened his words. His presence became suffocating, a constant reminder that I was no longer mother to a son but prey to a predator. The transformation was complete, and I had no choice but to accept it. Yet even as the danger escalated, I could not bring myself to turn him in. How could I, when every fiber of my being still remembered the child who once needed me? The thought of calling the authorities, of exposing him, felt like betraying not just him but myself, the mother who had vowed to protect him at all costs. And so I endured, silently carrying the weight of fear, silently preparing for the day when endurance might no longer be enough. The third attempt came when I least expected it. I had been walking down the staircase when I felt the sudden slip beneath my feet. The railing was slick with oil, invisible to the eye but deadly to the touch. My body lurched forward, and for a moment, I felt the terrifying rush of gravity pulling me down. By some miracle, I managed to catch myself, clinging desperately to the wall until my heart steadied. Only later, when I traced my fingers along the railing and felt the residue, did the truth sink in. It had not been an accident. It had been designed. That night I sat in the darkness of my room, my mind torn between terror and sorrow. My son had moved beyond warnings, beyond subtle threats. He was truly trying to end my life. And yet, even with that knowledge, my heart ached with love. How could I hate him when I still remembered the way his tiny hand once fit into mine? How could I protect myself when protection meant letting go of the boy I had devoted my life to? The betrayal was deeper than the threat itself. It was not simply that my son wanted to harm me. It was that I loved him still, even as he plotted against me. That love bound me to him, even as it endangered me. It was the cruelest prison of all, one I could neither escape nor destroy. And as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that the storm had fully arrived. The warnings were over. The attempts had begun. The next one might not fail. Time passed, and Daisy clung to the belief that things would eventually improve. She told herself that hardship was temporary, that her son's troubled behavior was a phase, and that her love as a mother would be enough to guide him back to the right path. But the cracks in their relationship only widened, spreading like invisible fractures through every corner of their home. The warmth she once felt when looking at Michael had faded, replaced with a constant sense of unease, as though she were living with someone who no longer recognized her as family. Michael's demands became sharper, edged with a cruelty that Daisy struggled to comprehend. He insisted on having more money, and when Daisy explained she did not have much to give, he dismissed her words as lies. He accused her of hoarding funds, of secretly enjoying watching him struggle, twisting her sacrifices into weapons against her. Every conversation ended in bitterness, and the house grew quieter afterward, filled with a silence heavy with tension. Daisy began to avoid even the smallest interactions, knowing that the wrong word or gesture could spark another storm. At night, when the rest of the world settled into calm, Daisy lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering where she had gone wrong. She replayed memories of Michael as a boy, the way he had once clung to her hand, the way his laughter used to light up the rooms. She tried to reconcile that image with the young man who now stood before her, filled with resentment, his eyes carrying a darkness she had never imagined possible. It felt like she had lost her son long before she realized he had slipped away. Friends and family members began to notice changes in Daisy. They saw the exhaustion etched into her face, the weariness in her movements, and the way her once bright spirit seemed dulled. When they asked what was wrong, Daisy brushed off their concern, unwilling to expose the painful truth about her son. She protected Michael even when he gave her little reason to, because admitting the depth of his cruelty would mean accepting that she had raised someone capable of such behavior. And that thought was almost too heavy to bear. But denial could not shield her forever. One evening, Daisy discovered that money was missing from her purse. At first, she thought it was a mistake, perhaps her own forgetfulness, but as the days went on, more small amounts disappeared. Then larger sums vanished from her bank account, withdrawals she did not remember making. It was Michael, she realized with a sickening clarity. He had crossed another line, stealing from the very woman who had given him everything she could. Still, Daisy did not confront him immediately. She told herself that maybe he was desperate, maybe he had no other way. The love that tied her to him made her hesitate, even as the betrayal stung like an open wound. When Daisy finally gathered the courage to speak, Michael's response cut deeper than the theft itself. He did not deny it, nor did he show remorse. Instead, he laughed, mocking her for thinking she could stop him. He reminded her that everything she had was, in his eyes, already his. The house, the money, even her peace of mind. He believed they belonged to him, as though her very existence was only to serve his needs. Daisy was left shaken, realizing that the boy she once raised had grown into someone who saw her not as a mother, but as an obstacle in his pursuit of control. From that point on, Daisy began to fear her own child. The fear was not sudden, but gradual, creeping into her bones until it became part of her daily life. Every noise in the house made her tense. Every look from Michael carried a weight she could not ignore. She found herself walking more softly, speaking more carefully, as though navigating a fragile surface that could shatter at any moment. The home she once built as a place of love had transformed into a cage, and Michael was both the prisoner and the warden. Daisy considered reaching out for help, but pride and shame held her back. She could not bear the thought of others knowing that her son had turned against her in such a way. She still believed in some hidden part of her heart that she could fix it, that if she endured long enough, if she loved deeply enough, Michael might remember who he once was. That fragile hope was all that kept her moving forward, even as the shadows in their relationship grew darker. The turning point came one evening when Daisy returned home later than usual. She had been running errands, trying to distract herself from the heaviness in her heart, when she walked into the house and felt an immediate chill. Michael was waiting, his eyes cold, his posture tense. He accused her of hiding money again, of keeping secrets from him. Daisy tried to explain, but before she could finish, he lashed out, not with words but with a shove that sent her stumbling back. For the first time, Michael's anger had crossed into physical violence, and Daisy felt her world fracture. She stood there, shaken, staring at her son as though seeing him for the first time. In that moment, she realized just how dangerous he had become, and how much she had blinded herself to his escalating behavior. The fear she had carried quietly within her erupted into full clarity. This was no longer just about betrayal or greed. This was about survival. But even then, with the sting of his aggression still fresh, Daisy could not turn off her love. Her heart ached with the contradiction of it, terrified of what her son might do, yet still clinging to the memory of the little boy she once adored. That tension tore at her, leaving her exhausted and confused, unsure of how to move forward. The following days were a blur of silence and unspoken tension. Michael acted as though nothing had happened, moving through the house with a chilling calm that unsettled Daisy even more than his anger had. It was as if he knew he had crossed the line and no longer cared. Daisy, meanwhile, felt herself shrinking inside her own home, caught between love and fear, between a mother's instinct to protect and a survivor's instinct to escape. And as the nights grew longer and the silence heavier, Daisy began to sense that Michael's hunger for control was not finished. He had tested the limits, and with no resistance, he would surely push further. The thought sent shivers through her, but she forced herself to hold on, believing that if she could endure just a little longer, perhaps there would still be a chance to save him. Yet deep inside, she knew the storm was only just beginning. The unraveling of trust is never sudden. It comes in waves, subtle and sharp, building until the crash is undeniable. For Daisy, the weeks following the shocking discovery of stolen money were a haze of confusion, grief, and bitter self-reflection. She replayed every moment with her son, searching for signs she had missed, wondering how long the boy she raised had been replacing love with calculation. Each memory that once warmed her now turned into evidence, small breadcrumbs leading her back to the truth she didn't want to accept. The sweet smile when he was younger, the requests that seemed innocent but always urgent, the way he grew distant when he didn't get his way, pieces of a puzzle she was only now fitting together. The house, once her sanctuary, began to feel haunted. She would walk past the kitchen and remember him laughing at the table, and then that image would be cut through with the thought of him, crouched in her bedroom, rifling through her purse or breaking into her locked drawer. The walls seemed to hold his betrayal, each corner whispering the reminder that this was not an accident or a moment of weakness. It was a pattern, deliberate and cruel. Daisy tried to continue her routines, cooking, cleaning, caring for her grandchildren when they visited, but there was an unease that followed her like a shadow. Her nights became the hardest. Sleep rarely came peacefully, and when it did, it carried her into dreams filled with half-formed images of her son. Sometimes she would see him as a boy, running into her arms after a scraped knee, looking at her with unguarded trust. Other times he would appear as the man he had become, his eyes cold, his hands grabbing at what wasn't his, a stranger in her son's skin. She woke often with her heart racing, torn between longing for the child she remembered and fearing the man who now lived under her roof. Despite the pain, Daisy could not bring herself to confront him directly. Each time she thought she had gathered the courage, she looked at his face and saw not just betrayal but her own flesh and blood. The love of a mother held her back, convincing her to wait, to hope, to believe he would confess on his own. She began to rationalize his actions, telling herself that perhaps he was desperate, perhaps he felt entitled to more because life had been unfair to him. But deep down another voice whispered, one she tried to silence, that this was no longer about need. It was about greed, control, and something darker brewing beneath his surface. The wider family began to sense that something was wrong. Daisy's daughter visited one afternoon and noticed the way her mother's hands trembled as she poured tea. Questions were asked, concerns raised, but Daisy brushed them aside with practiced smiles. She could not bear the thought of admitting that her son had crossed such unforgivable lines. To speak it aloud felt like betraying him further, and so she carried the weight in silence, shielding him even as he tore her apart. It was an unbearable paradox, protecting the very person she needed protection from. As days turned into weeks, small incidents began to escalate. Items continued to disappear, jewelry, household electronics, even sentimental trinkets with no real value beyond memory. Daisy would find drawers left ajar, cupboards ransacked, her privacy eroded inch by inch. She told herself it was still possible to forgive, that material things could be replaced. But forgiveness grew harder when she realized he was no longer just stealing objects. He was stealing her peace, her dignity, and her sense of safety. The tension within the home thickened. Daisy felt like a guest in her own life, moving quietly, avoiding conflict, hoping to keep the fragile bond intact. Yet her son seemed emboldened by her silence, testing boundaries with sharper edges. He began raising his voice more often, dismissing her questions, twisting her words to make her feel guilty for doubting him. It was a subtle erosion of control, each argument chipping away at her confidence until she began to question her own instincts. Perhaps she had misunderstood, perhaps she was being unfair. It was easier to blame herself than to accept that her child was becoming her tormentor. But reality has a way of forcing its hand. One evening, Daisy returned home from a visit with a neighbor and noticed something chilling. The lock to her bedroom door had been forced again, but this time it wasn't just drawers disturbed or items missing. Her most private box, one that held letters, photographs, and keepsakes from her late husband, lay open and overturned. The contents were scattered on the floor, trampled carelessly as though they held no meaning. It wasn't about money anymore, it was about control, about tearing at the core of who she was. Standing there, clutching the box in her hands, Daisy felt something inside her fracture. The grief that followed was heavy, but it brought clarity. This was no longer about a troubled son making mistakes. This was about a dangerous man testing how much he could take before his mother broke entirely. The realization settled like ice in her veins. She had excused, forgiven, justified, but each chance she gave him became another weapon he used against her. The love that had once been her strength was becoming her greatest vulnerability. And yet, even in the midst of despair, Daisy felt an aching, complicated love. She thought of the boy who had once clung to her hand, who had cried in her lap, who had whispered promises of never leaving her side. That boy was still alive somewhere deep within him, wasn't he? She wanted to believe it, needed to believe it for her own heart's survival. So she resolved to endure, to hope, to hold on to the possibility of change even as the evidence mounted against it. But survival is not always a matter of endurance. Sometimes it is about recognizing danger before it consumes you. And as Daisy sat in her dimly lit room, staring at the broken lock and the scattered memories, she felt for the first time the creeping certainty that her son's betrayal was no longer confined to theft or manipulation. Something darker was stirring, something that reached beyond greed and into the realm of violence. The silence in the house that night was suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the wind against the windows made her heart lurch. It was as if the walls themselves were warning her, urging her to see the truth she had been avoiding. Daisy knew then that the story was far from over. What had begun with missing bills and broken trust was only the beginning. A storm was gathering, and she was standing directly in its path. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing had become undeniable. The son she loved was becoming her greatest threat. And in that realization, Daisy felt the quiet dread of knowing that the worst was yet to come. The storm that had been quietly brewing for years finally began to crack open in ways I could no longer ignore. Up until that point, I had tried to explain away my son's actions, convincing myself that his outbursts were temporary, that his anger was simply stress manifesting itself, that his cruelty was an unfortunate phase he would outgrow. But there comes a time when even a mother's ability to rationalize runs dry, when the truth presents itself so starkly that it cannot be denied. That time had come for me, though my heart resisted every inch of the way. Michael's temper, once a frightening but sporadic eruption, became a constant presence in the house. The air itself seemed thick with his fury. He didn't need to scream for me to feel it anymore. Even the silence carried a weight, a kind of heaviness that warned me danger was always one wrong step away. Small disagreements spiraled into chaos. Ordinary conversations became traps. His words had sharpened into weapons, cutting not only at my confidence but also at my very sense of reality. He would twist events until I questioned my memory, until I began to wonder if perhaps I was the problem, if perhaps his cruelty was deserved. That was his mastery, turning blame so cleverly that it always landed at my feet. It was during this period that I started noticing money vanishing in ways that couldn't be explained. Small amounts at first, barely enough to raise suspicion, but then larger withdrawals, bank accounts showing transfers I hadn't approved. I would confront Michael gently, not accusing but simply asking if he knew what had happened. He would feign offense, acting as though I were attacking him, turning my questions into accusations of mistrust. His response was always the same. How dare I suspect my own son? The shame would settle deep in me, convincing me to let the matter go. But the missing money kept growing, and eventually I could no longer deny that my own child was siphoning away the stability I had worked so hard to build. The realization cut deeper than any betrayal I had ever endured. This was not a stranger stealing from me, not a distant relative with envy in their heart. This was my son, the boy I had carried, nursed, protected. The one whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose nightmares I had chased away with lullabies. Now he was the one creating nightmares, and no amount of love could disguise that truth. Yet even then my heart tried to excuse him. Maybe he needed help and didn't know how to ask. Maybe the world had broken him in ways I didn't see. Mothers are experts at finding excuses when the truth feels unbearable. But things escalated further than money. I noticed items in the house disappearing. Jewelry, heirlooms, even sentimental objects that had no monetary value but meant everything to me. A necklace from my own mother gone. A locket that held the photo of his late father, missing without explanation. Each loss was another wound, not because of the material value but because of what it signified. He wasn't just stealing things, he was stripping away memories, tearing apart pieces of my past. It was as though he wanted to erase me, to hollow out my existence until there was nothing left but his dominance. Around this time his anger took a darker turn. I began to see a glint in his eyes that unsettled me more than the shouting or the threats. It was something cold, calculated, almost predatory. He no longer reacted impulsively. Instead, he seemed to plan his cruelty, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I started to sense that he enjoyed watching me flinch, enjoyed the power he held over my fear. That was when the thought first whispered in my mind, a thought I tried desperately to push away, that my son might one day cross a line from intimidation to physical harm. The nights became the hardest. I would lie awake listening to the creaks of the house, every sound magnified by the silence. When I heard footsteps in the hallway, I would hold my breath, praying he would pass my door without stopping. I began locking my bedroom at night, ashamed of myself for doing so, but unable to sleep otherwise. Even then I never felt safe. Fear had moved in permanently, becoming an unwelcome guest that followed me everywhere. What kept me clinging to hope was the memory of the boy he had once been. The gentle child with a laugh that could light up a room. The boy who used to hold my hand tightly when crossing the street. The son who once promised to take care of me when I grew old. That boy was gone, but in my heart, I kept searching for traces of him. As if by sheer will I could bring him back. Every time Michael showed the slightest softness, even for a fleeting moment, I latched onto it as proof that the good still lived within him. It was foolish, perhaps, but mothers are fueled by hope even when logic tells them otherwise. Then came the night that changed everything. I had discovered another large withdrawal from my account and confronted him with more firmness than I usually dared. I couldn't afford to lose more. My security was slipping away. His response was not the defensive anger I had come to expect. Instead, he went quiet, his expression unreadable, his silence more terrifying than his shouting had ever been. He looked at me with a stillness that made my blood run cold. In that moment I saw something I had never allowed myself to imagine before. A willingness to hurt me not just emotionally but physically. That look lingered with me long after he left the room. It was the look of someone who had detached from me entirely. Someone who no longer saw his mother but an obstacle standing in the way of what he wanted. It was the look of a stranger wearing my son's face. From that night onward, I lived in a constant state of hypervigilance. I checked locks twice, sometimes 3 times. I avoided being alone in the house with him whenever possible. The trust that had once been unshakable between us was now shattered beyond repair. Yet even in my fear I couldn't stop loving him. That was the most painful part, knowing he might one day destroy me, and yet my heart still beat with a mother's love for him. It was a love that refused to die, no matter how much danger it placed me in. The realization of his growing darkness didn't push me away from him. Instead, it chained me tighter. I became desperate to save him, believing that if I gave him just one more chance, if I showed him unwavering love, I could guide him back from the edge. But the truth was that he had already crossed over into a place where my love alone could not reach. And deep down, though I didn't want to admit it, I knew the danger was no longer something I could ignore. As the weeks passed, that cold look in his eyes appeared more frequently. It was no longer fleeting, it lingered, a constant reminder of what was to come. The son I had raised was slipping further away, and in his place someone darker was emerging. And as I stood at the edge of that terrifying realization, I understood that the story of my son and me was far from over. The worst was yet to come. The silence of the hospital room was almost suffocating, yet it was in that silence that the greatest truths revealed themselves. Daisy lay in the bed, her body weakened from the attempt on her life, her heart torn between grief and resilience. The constant beeping of the monitor beside her was both a reminder of her fragile state and a declaration that she was still here, still breathing, still holding on despite everything. Though she should have felt consumed by anger or hatred, what weighed most heavily on her heart was the unrelenting ache of a mother's love. It was an ache so deep that even betrayal, even violence, could not erase it. The days blurred together, filled with medical tests, hushed conversations, and the steady stream of family members who alternated between checking in and avoiding her gaze. Everyone seemed to want answers, yet no one wanted to confront the reality head-on. Her daughter wept quietly in corners, torn between loyalty to her mother and disbelief about her brother's actions. Extended relatives called, their voices dripping with shock, but beneath the concern there was gossip, whispers about how such darkness could exist within a family that had once seemed ordinary. Daisy could sense the shift, the subtle way people looked at her differently, as though tragedy had stained her permanently. But the deepest turmoil was not in the looks of others, it was in the battle within her own heart. Each night when the nurses dimmed the lights and the hallways fell quiet, Daisy's thoughts drifted back to her son, the child she had carried, nurtured, and loved with everything she had, now bound by the chains of his own rage and greed. She wondered how long the signs had been there. Had she been blind? Had she been too eager to forgive, too ready to excuse behaviors that in hindsight were flashing warnings of what was to come? These questions tormented her, each one cutting deeper than the last. In those long hours she remembered the sweet moments of his childhood, the way he had clung to her hand on the first day of school, the laughter that had once filled their home, the small acts of tenderness that only a mother notices. Those memories collided violently with the reality of the present, with the knowledge that the same boy had grown into a man who had tried to end her life. It was almost unbearable, yet still she could not stop loving him. That love felt like both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. News of the attack began to spread beyond the family circle. Local reporters caught wind of it, their curiosity feeding on the sensational nature of the crime. A son plotting against his mother, not for survival or desperation, but for money and control. Headlines painted the story in dramatic strokes, turning Daisy into both victim and symbol. She found herself at the center of a narrative she had never chosen. Her private pain dissected for public consumption. People who had never known her suddenly felt entitled to judge, to speculate about her family, to cast blame in every direction. Through it all, Daisy stayed quiet. She refused to speak to the media, refused to let strangers define her story. She knew that the truth of what had happened was not something that could be captured in headlines or whispers. It was raw, messy, and rooted in years of family history that no outsider could truly understand. Yet their judgment stung nonetheless, adding another layer to the already overwhelming weight she carried. The legal process moved forward relentlessly. Her son, arrested and charged, was facing the consequences of his actions, though his demeanor remained unsettlingly cold. From her hospital bed, Daisy received updates about the case. Each update felt like a dagger, both necessary and unbearable. She did not attend the hearings, physically too weak and emotionally unprepared to face him across a courtroom. But she knew the time would come when she would have to, when the story of what he had done would be laid bare before strangers in black robes and wooden benches. Yet, beneath her fear, a quiet strength began to stir. She realized that surviving the attack had given her a new purpose. Not only to heal, but to confront the truth she had avoided for so long. No longer could she dismiss his anger as immaturity, his greed as mere mistakes, his cruelty as temporary lapses. She saw now with painful clarity the man he had become, shaped by choices that had led him down a dark and twisted path. She could not change those choices, nor could she shield him from their consequences. What she could do, however, was survive. And in surviving, she could reclaim the narrative that betrayal had stolen from her. As the days passed, Daisy's body slowly began to heal. The bruises faded, the wounds knit themselves closed, but the scars, both visible and invisible, remained. She learned to walk again without trembling, to hold herself upright even as the weight of memory pressed down. Family members tried to comfort her, yet many struggled with their own pain, their own anger at the son who had betrayed them all. Daisy, however, stood in the middle, torn between the justice they demanded and the compassion she still felt for the child she had raised. Late one night, as she sat awake in the dim light of her room, Daisy came to a realization that settled deep into her soul. Her story was not just one of betrayal, it was also one of survival. Though her son had tried to take her life, he had not succeeded. Though he had tried to silence her voice, she still had the power to speak. And though he had tried to break her spirit, she refused to let him win. Still, the road ahead was uncertain. She knew the trial would test her resolve, dragging her through painful memories and forcing her to relive the horror. She knew the world would judge her, some condemning her for continuing to love her son, others for not having seen the danger sooner. She knew the family would fracture, loyalties splintering under the strain of betrayal. But in that moment of clarity, she made a silent vow to herself. She would face it all, because love, even wounded and scarred, still burned within her. It was not the kind of love that excused his actions or denied the danger he posed. It was the kind of love that acknowledged the pain, bore the weight of betrayal, and yet chose to endure. It was a mother's love, twisted and battered but unbreakable. And so, as the hospital lights dimmed and the world outside continued on with its indifference, Daisy prepared herself for the next chapter of her life. She was no longer just a victim of betrayal. She was a survivor, standing at the edge of a battle that was far from over, ready to confront the storm that was still to come. The chapter of survival was not the end. It was only the beginning of the reckoning. The weeks that followed were marked by silence, a silence so deep that it echoed louder than words ever could. Daisy's life had been reduced to a rhythm of loneliness and reflection, her days blending together in a haze of sorrow and reluctant strength. Her body was still healing from the attack, her soul trying to patch together pieces that seemed permanently shattered. The house felt both like a sanctuary and a prison, the walls bearing witness to a betrayal too grave to forget. Each step she took down the hallway carried the weight of memory, each glance toward the family photographs on the wall, a cruel reminder of the child who had turned into her predator. Daisy replayed the night of the attack countless times in her mind, wondering what moment in the past had planted the seed of hatred in her son's heart. She searched her memories for the turning point, a crack in the foundation where resentment had slipped in unnoticed. It was a fruitless search, for no single moment could explain how love had soured into murderous intent. And yet, despite the horror, despite the unforgivable nature of what he had done, her heart ached for him. The instinct to protect, the pull of motherhood, was still alive in her even though it had nearly cost her life. Outsiders who knew of the incident looked at her with disbelief when she spoke of love. They expected anger, bitterness, a thirst for justice or revenge, but Daisy's emotions were more complex. She did not deny the betrayal, nor the terror she had endured, but alongside that was a compassion she could not extinguish. It was as though the bond between mother and child was immune to logic, a force that persisted even in the shadow of violence. The duality tore at her, love interwoven with fear, loyalty entwined with pain. Her son, meanwhile, sat behind the cold walls of a detention center, awaiting the decision of courts and officials who could never fully grasp the nuances of blood ties. To them, he was a criminal, a case number, a young man who had crossed the line of morality and law. To Daisy, he was still the boy she had once carried in her arms, whose first steps she had celebrated, whose laughter once filled their home. She could not reconcile the image of that child with the young man who had nearly stolen her breath forever. The world around her became divided. Friends and distant relatives offered support, but many urged her to cut him off completely, to save herself from further harm. Their advice was practical, even wise, but it felt incomplete. She wondered if they could ever understand the ache of a mother's heart, the impossible truth that love does not vanish simply because it has been betrayed. Daisy understood the danger he posed. She did not romanticize his cruelty or deny the selfishness that had fueled his act. Yet, even in acknowledging his darkness, she could not detach herself fully. Her nights became the hardest. Alone in bed, with the quiet pressing down on her, Daisy's thoughts spiraled. She wondered what her son felt now, if he was remorseful, if prison walls forced him to reflect on what he had done. She imagined his isolation, his anger, his confusion, and her heart swelled with both sorrow and guilt. Had she failed him somehow? Had she missed the signs, the small moments when intervention might have changed the course of his life? These questions haunted her, each one a thorn digging deeper. As the trial loomed closer, Daisy faced an unbearable decision. She was called upon to give her statement, her testimony that would shape the outcome of his fate. It was not just about the facts of what had happened. It was about whether she would press for the harshest punishment or plead for mercy. The weight of that choice pressed on her chest like a stone. Justice demanded one path. Love pulled her toward another. She could not escape the truth that whichever road she chose, part of her would break further. The days leading to the trial were filled with preparation. Lawyers visited her, investigators asked questions, and officials pressed her for clarity. They wanted certainty where Daisy felt none. Every retelling of the story drained her, pulling her back into the terror of that night. Yet in those retellings she also heard her own voice softened when speaking of him, describing not just the act but the years before it, the boy he once was. Those listening did not always understand, but Daisy could not stop herself from weaving love into even the darkest recounting. The community around her was divided as well. Some saw her as a tragic figure, a woman wronged by the very child she had given life to. Others judged her harshly, questioning why she continued to speak of love, why she refused to sever ties completely. They whispered that she was weak, that she was blind. Daisy bore these judgments with quiet endurance. She knew the world was quick to draw lines of black and white, but life within a family was far murkier. She did not expect them to understand, because even she could barely make sense of her heart. On the eve of the trial, Daisy sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from her. Once that chair had been filled with her son, slouched in casual indifference or chattering about trivial things. Now it sat vacant, a ghost of normalcy that had been shattered. Daisy traced her finger along the wood grain of the table, her mind heavy with the knowledge that tomorrow would set a path neither of them could return from. It would either be the severing of ties through punishment or the fragile hope of redemption if leniency was granted. The weight of motherhood pressed against her, heavier than ever. She wondered if loving him still made her complicit, if it meant she was denying the gravity of his crime. Yet she knew in her bones that love was not forgiveness, nor was it an excuse. It was simply a fact, as undeniable as the scars she now carried. Her love was bruised, battered, reshaped into something complicated and painful, but it was still there. When dawn broke the next day, Daisy knew she was walking into a storm. The courthouse would not just be a place of law. It would be a stage where her heart, her choices, and her loyalty would be displayed for all to scrutinize. The truth was, she did not know what words would escape her lips when the time came to speak. She only knew that whatever she said, it would carry both the wound of betrayal and the weight of love. The trial would begin, and with it, the world would see a mother and son bound together by a tragedy that had no easy resolution. Daisy took a breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead, knowing that the next chapter of her life, and his, was about to be written in the cold ink of the law. And as she stepped into that day, the story of betrayal was far from over. It was entering its most unforgiving stage, where truth and consequence would collide. The aftermath of betrayal carried with it a weight far heavier than any physical wound Daisy had ever known. The truth was no longer something she could hide, no longer a private storm contained within the walls of her own home. It was out there, exposed, dissected, and placed under the harsh light of justice. The trial had revealed everything, not only the cruelty of a son toward his mother but the destruction of innocence, the erosion of trust, and the irreversible collapse of what once was a family. The court may have delivered its judgment, but for Daisy, the punishment was not only her son's sentence. It was the enduring reality that she had lost him long before the gavel struck. She left the courthouse on the final day with a silence in her chest that seemed to echo louder than the chaos of cameras flashing around her. The world looked at her with pity, with curiosity, even with judgment. But only Daisy knew what it felt like to bury a child who was still alive. To her, the prison walls that now confined her son were nothing compared to the prison of memory she carried every waking moment. Love had not been enough to save him, and now it became the very reason she could never be free. In the months that followed, Daisy's life slowed into a rhythm of survival. The house, once filled with restless footsteps and arguments that tore holes in the air, became hauntingly quiet. The silence was no longer a relief, it was a reminder. Every corner whispered of what had happened. The sofa where she once sat waiting for her son to come home, the kitchen where she cooked meals that went untouched, the stairs where she once heard his heavy footsteps, all of it transformed into monuments of grief. She existed in that house as a caretaker of ghosts. But grief was never still. It shifted, evolved, and reshaped itself into countless forms. At times, it was an unbearable heaviness that kept her anchored to her bed. At other times, it came as rage, a fury against herself for not seeing the danger sooner, against life for giving her love only to rip it away. Yet, in her quietest moments, it was sorrow mixed with a stubborn tenderness, the kind only a mother could feel. For even after everything, her heart could not sever the bond that tied her to her son. Letters began arriving from the prison. At first, Daisy left them unopened, stacking them in a drawer she never touched. She feared what they might contain: anger, manipulation, or empty promises. But curiosity gnawed at her. When she finally unfolded the first letter, the words spilled out like fragments of a broken confession. Her son wrote not of love, but of excuses, of blaming others, of trying to twist reality to his advantage. It was a chilling reminder that remorse had not yet taken root. The letters were not bridges. They were chains pulling her back into the cycle of pain. Still, she kept them. Not because she believed the words, but because throwing them away felt like throwing him away completely. She was torn between the need to protect herself and the refusal to surrender hope entirely. That fragile hope, as painful as it was, became the only thread that connected her to the boy she once held in her arms, the child she once believed could never cause harm. Time passed, and Daisy discovered that survival did not mean forgetting. It meant learning to live with what could never be undone. She began writing in a journal, not to make sense of the tragedy, because some things would never make sense, but to release the weight pressing against her chest. Each entry was a mixture of anger, sorrow, and reluctant forgiveness. She did not forgive the act, nor did she absolve her son of the choices he made. But she forgave herself for loving him still, for carrying that love even when the world told her she should not. The community around her moved on as communities often do. Neighbors stopped whispering, the news cycle turned its attention elsewhere, and the world continued spinning. But for Daisy, life had split into a before and after. Every smile she gave was shadowed. Every breath carried with it the memory of betrayal. Yet she chose to keep moving. She began volunteering at a shelter for women, finding purpose in sharing her story with others who had endured different forms of betrayal and violence. In their eyes, she saw reflections of her own struggle. In their survival, she found fragments of strength she thought she had lost. Years later, Daisy visited the prison, not because she believed in reconciliation, but because she needed to see for herself the man her son had become. When she sat across from him, separated by glass, she no longer saw the boy she raised. His eyes carried a hardness, his words were rehearsed, his smile a mask. And yet, beneath all of it, she caught a fleeting glimpse of the child he once was, a shadow of innocence long buried. That glimpse was enough to remind her of why she had loved him so fiercely, and why that love would never completely die, no matter how twisted the path had become. Walking away from that visit, Daisy realized that love and danger truly could live under the same roof. She had housed both, nurtured both, and survived both. The story of her son's betrayal was no longer just a personal tragedy. It was a warning, a reminder to others of how easily love could be manipulated, how quickly family could become a battlefield. She had lived it, endured it, and now carried it as part of her truth. Her story did not end in despair, though the pain never fully disappeared. It ended in resilience. Daisy had been broken, but she had not been destroyed. She learned that survival was not about erasing scars, but about wearing them as proof of endurance. Her son may have tried to take her life, but he could not take her spirit. And in that truth she found her freedom. As Daisy looked back on her life, she understood that love was never simple. It was both the source of her greatest joy and her deepest sorrow. It bound her to a child who became her betrayer. It blinded her when she should have seen the warning signs. And yet, it also gave her the strength to endure. Love had not saved her son, but it had saved her. Because in choosing to keep her heart open, even when it hurt, she chose not to let bitterness define her. Her story remained etched in her memory, not as a wound that consumed her, but as a reminder of what it meant to be human, to love, to hurt, to fall, and to rise again. And so, Daisy closed this chapter of her life not with an ending, but with a lesson. A lesson that danger does not always come from strangers, that betrayal often wears the face of someone we love, and that survival means carrying both the love and the scars together. Her story was one of heartbreak, of true crime, of betrayal, but most of all of resilience. This was Daisy's story, one of love twisted into betrayal, of a mother who survived the unthinkable. Her son tried to take her life, but he could not take her strength. Sometimes the darkest battles are fought within our own homes, and the scars they leave behind tell us more about survival than any victory ever could. If this story touched you, remember, you are not alone in your struggles. Share this video, subscribe for more real stories of heartbreak, betrayal, and resilience, and never forget, even in the deepest pain, there is a way forward.